like to stop, or if you've exhausted your answer, if it's a response to a question, you say, I guess I can't remember any more about that. Because when this film is edited, my voice will be completely out of it. And what we'll be using is snippets of yours.
Yeah.
So don't feel constrained that you look bad, because we can take anything else that makes you look bad.
A lot of things you can do, huh?
Yeah, you will. Okay, good. You told me in a conversation once about what it was like coming to work on the railroad. I think it was 1946. Do you recall that conversation?
I don't think so, Dick.
Well, you talked about getting off the train at Smyrna with your mattress on your back and
get off the bus.
The bus and walking for. Would you just repeat that?
Well, you see, I'd be home. I'd come home late Saturday night. Let's say I was on 212 dismissing in Oakfield. So I had to come home. I forget now what's the best way I could, but I had to leave there on the bus Sunday morning. So I just really had just overnight Saturday with the family. So I'd get the bus about 8 o'clock out of Fort Kent with my bedroll and everything else, my lunch bucket, and I'd get off at Smyrna Mills, and that's 2 miles all the way around back up to the buggy track. And a lot of times, well, they didn't plow snow then like they do now, and I was in a foot of snow with all that. But I never minded that, though, because I'd worked in the woods before in the lumber camps, and that, I mean, when I got on the railroad, that was just like heaven to me, you know, to be working here, and those little things like walking like that never bothered me at all.
How about the being away from home so much? Now, if you worked, if your time off during the week was just Saturday night, that's a pretty full schedule.
Well, I never did think much of that, because really I was home every week, and then every other night, if I was on 212 to 11, I'd be home one night and in Oakfield the next, and that was just one of those things, and I never thought anything of that. And the wife neither, I guess.
Tell me what the work was like.
Well, it's a funny thing when you start working as a brakeman. You want to do so much, and you're never at the right place at the right time. But once you get a hold of it, then it comes, and it's, to me, I'd go to bed at night and I was anxious to get up in the morning to go to work. Because it was almost like playing, anybody that plays bridge or something like that, it's almost like a game. You know, when you handle the list, it's switching boxcars, but it's really another different moves every day. And it's almost like a game, and that's why I thought it was so interesting, and I liked it.
What skills make a good brakeman? I mean, you talk about the challenge of it. What are the skills that help you do that?
Well, I think it's the if you're willing to work, and I think that's, and then pay attention to what's going on and why all of these moves are. Let's say when you start, you really don't know what is going on. But the fellow that's handling the lace, well, he'll tell you, well, we're going to do this, and you can ask him why, or you don't have to at first, because no matter if he does tell you, it won't sink in, you know. But after a while, so it's really paying attention to what's going on, and then the willingness to do it.
What makes a smooth working train crew?
Well, I found that some conductors, not conductors, but well, a conductor, yes, if he watches you, and he'll help the head brakeman that's handling the list, and the way he goes about his work. I've seen Ray Violet and Madore, my God, Ray turned the switch, and we wouldn't use it for an hour after that or something like that. But when you needed it, it was turned. And Ray'd be walking all the time, turning a switch here, turning a switch there, telling you what to do. And so I thought he was one of the smoothest brakemen that I ever broke for when I was a brakeman.
You mentioned Ray Violet. Who were some of the other men who influenced you when you were a young man?
Well, way back, Bert Michaud was one of the old fellows that, worked with Bert. Clarence Dumont worked a lot with Clarence. Clarence was a good brakeman too. I like working with Clarence. Yeah. But Bert was one of the oldest fellows there. Well, one of the first fellows I worked with, I guess, on 83 and 4, and that was a lot of work then.
Tell me about the number of trains that you ran during those times.
You mean that I worked on?
No, I mean, it must have been a busier railroad than what we know now.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the people who are seeing this video won't be able to understand what it was like, say, in 1948, 49, during those big potato years when things were moving. You had passenger trains and all the activity.
Well, at first, when I first started, Dick, a lot of the work was done during the, let's say, like those two sides of 212, first and second 212, and then first and second 211. Well, we'd do a lot of work in the daytime, switching potatoes and stuff like that, you know. And I suppose, well, the farmer would come to work, he'd probably work a couple of hours, and he had to take his bag down, and we probably had a hold of his car for a couple of hours. Well, his men weren't doing anything. Well, after a while, that got to, they put these small locals on at night, see. So a farmer could work all day without being bothered at all. It was awful good for him, but for a brakeman, you know that we'd go to work at 4:30, 5 o'clock at night, then the weather used to drop about 30, 40 degrees colder during the night. And that was, I thought it was awful hard on the brakeman. And then in the dark, we never had any lights, you know. It's not like a, let's say, Oakfield Yard, there's lights in the yard, but there wasn't any in Fort Kent Yard and any yard we'd work in, Frenchville, Cleveland and all stuff like that. But then they had those these little locals, you had them all over, and then 212 would pick them up in the morning with a couple of units, and they'd start south with that, pick up here. Of course, they'd do some small work at, well, then there was no McDonald's, no Scaries. That was just a track where they'd put ties there in the carload of ties in the spring to use in the summer and stuff like that. But the trains, I remember one time, really, when I first started, I didn't know what it was all about. But we got to Squapan. Old Ralph told us, he says, you fellas haul into a certain track. We were on 212. And so we got the orders. 86 was on a cutoff into clear. And we got our orders and got into to clear someplace there in the yard. And he says, we have to wait for 212 to come now, because he says there's, John Pinette was on second 211. He says he left Oakfield, told us a time, but we don't know where he is. So the only way to get us through there is to wait till 22 comes through. First class train, you know, a timetable. So when they came, they slapped green on him. So the 22 left, 10 minutes behind. 86 followed, then we left behind 86, 10 minutes behind, and we were wearing green also for another train, another local on the cutoff, see. When we got to, I remember that, John was just over the cutoff, and there was a little shack there to wait for, take the passenger train, see. John was there, he always had a cigar. And when we come there and we blew to bring attention to our signals, his hat hit the ground, his cigar hit the ground, and when we come by, his lips were going like that. Well, my God, I knew why he took his cap off. He must have been praying. By the way his lips were going, to talking direct to the Lord. Well, I thought that was quite funny. Poor job. But that's the way, you know. One time I walked into the yard office, and I think there was a superintendent. I think it was Bert Smith. And he had that telephone walking from looking up the Ashland Main and then up the Holton main line, and after a while he hung up. He says, you know how many trains I got now between Squapan and Oakfield? I was getting no idea. 7. And he said, I don't know where one of them is. Yeah, that's something now, yeah. So that's how.
Okay, we're running. I can hear a beep, and that means they're running out of tape.
There was only two switchers.
This was, you were saying that you worked where?
In Oakfield Yard, on a switcher. It came up for bid, nobody bid on it. So they told me that I was assigned to it. So I stayed at Mrs. Porter there, boarded there, and the night switcher, we worked 7 days a week, and a lot of times they'd dismiss us 15 hours and 55 minutes just so we wouldn't go into that 10-hour rest, see. But still, I was young. Yard, well, we weren't used to having section men clean the yard outside, you know. But in Oakfield Yard was always somebody there to clean switches in a snowstorm. And
it must have made a tremendous difference, Lionel, when they brought in the radio.
oh my God! And what made it? I can't understand, Dick. When I first come on, they were just going into these electric lanterns, and I don't know how these fellas, when they were, well, I've worked with a kerosene lantern, not on the railroad, but around the house home, going to the barn, stuff like that. And when you give signals with a kerosene lantern and that thing will go out and it's storming and windy, how did they get the thing lit again? You didn't have any radio. You were just out there in the black to get the thing going.
What do you remember most about the coming of the radio?
Well, there was I think, now if I remember right, when it first come on, it was just a radio on the engine and a big thing in the buggy. They had their own generator, stuff like that. And that was just for the conductor to give a highball on the rear. I guess that's all he used it for, unless it'd be backing up, you know, and giving signals. But other than that, that's all. But then when you had these little things and you were able to switch with that, and that was great. That was a big...
And we had an awful lot of people here early on. That must have helped do the same work with fewer people. Would that be reasonable to assume?
You mean? No.
The radio? Did it increase productivity?
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. Because instead of having, let's say you had 3 men, of course, and instead of having one that working in a curve and having to be where he could see the fellows giving signal and be able to relay to the engineer, well, you were there helping you know, you're all together helping the boys there. So that was really almost like another man when that radio was there. See? Well, yes, that radio helped a lot.
You mentioned Ralph Rafford, who was one of my favorite people in the whole world. I never saw Ralph when he was out of sorts or anything. He always had a grin. Do you have any memories of him?
Well, I know he used to talk awful loud. I forget now how that goes. Somebody couldn't understand anything. Well, he says, just open the window and you'll be able to hear me. You were talking on the radio about a mile away. I couldn't make him out. Yeah, Ralph was a good old boy. Arnold was a chip off the old block too. He was nice to work with, Engineer Arnold.
Was he Ralph's son?
Yeah, yeah. And then Pinky was at...
I knew both the boys.
Yeah.
I had forgot that they were brothers, but I thought I would.
Yeah. Yeah. Pinky was at Miss Hardis, operated there.
Now, you were an engineer with Arnold. Arnold had, as I recall, a good reputation as being able to get a train over the road.
Yes, he was. And he was nice to work with. I never was an engineer. I never worked with Arnold there like that. I worked as a brakeman in Caribou. Him as an engineer, but he was always a lot of fun, never grouchy or anything like that, you know. Nice to work with.
What do you remember about the passenger train era?
Well, I never worked on the main line, just on 21 and 2 as baggage master. And I didn't like it. It was, I don't know, I didn't know enough about it, I guess, and I was afraid of taking mail by a station and stuff like that. But I never worked it too much.
Now, 21 and 22, was that the gin train?
That's a gin train, yeah.
Tell me about the gin train. Tell me how it got its name.
That's one thing I don't know. I thought it was maybe the camps at St. Croix, Howbrook, and that's how those men would go there in the fall of the year and stay there. Well, probably come down after winter. I don't know how, but anyway, probably they'd haul a lot of their grub in there, and their liquor too. See, I'm not sure of that, but that's why I thought that's because anybody that went down, when he came up, he always had a bottle in his hind pocket, so gin or this white stuff then, what the heck they call a split or?
I believe the splits were an outgrowth of Prohibition, and that was something that was grain alcohol that used several ways.
Well, I think that's why they call it that. They'd mix it with, 2 to 1 or something like that.
Were the passengers unruly occasionally?
I never, not unruly. No, sometimes you see somebody feeling good, but it wasn't anything that worried anybody, you know.
Who was the conductor that you worked under?
Old Harold Fletcher. He was a good old boy.
Tell me about him. What you remember of him.
Well, Harold was awful nice to, nice to everybody. But somebody, that was coming up there with a drink. Don't put that on your, well, anyway, they'd offer him a drink, of course. He's the conductor of the train, the captain. Well, he'd say, well, I can't drink now. But he says, there's a little bottle there in the toilet. He says, put a little bit in there. He says, I'll have it when I get home. So if that was all mixed, everybody'd come, he'd tell him the same thing, and Harold would take his little pint home at night.
Do you remember his little poem that he liked to quote? Long or short or tall, big or small, B&A toilets, fit them all?
I never know. That was one of his sayings?
Yes. The people on the branch at that time used that train to go short distances. I've talked with people who came in from Plaisted to Fort Kent just for the kids going to the movies in the afternoon. Do you remember that?
Yeah, there was a flag station at, I forget the name of that place. It's just about 3 miles out of town. There was a flag station there, and come into town, do their shopping and return, and whatever else they had to do. And then there was this old, the old hermit that, it was on the, that stream between going into to Winterville. You don't remember him, huh? He stayed there for years, and he'd catch the train. That's how no radios, no electric lights, nothing. I don't think he had a radio, you know. And he'd, every once in a while, he'd come out, go for his grub. And then a lot of camps down the road after that, they'd go hunting. And
did you ever drop off in your crew papers and milk to Squeal McNeil at Weeksboro?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Tell me about what you remember of Squeal.
Well, he was always out there giving us a wave. And every time we'd either north or south, he'd hear us coming. Well, there was a bunch of curves, and the engineer would blow whistle, see, and he was out there giving us a. And every once in a while, he'd have his flag out, and we stopped. You know, a lot of times after the gin train, we used to haul passengers to the freights, and you had 100 and some car train, and we'd have to spot that buggy to pick up or let off some hunters. And you know, John, Dick, that fellow that I think he went hunting at St. Croix. He got off there. I remember when he got off, and he got lost, and they never found him to this day, and not that I know of. He was supposed to be pretty high up in the scouts too. They couldn't understand how come that he got lost. It was in the fall of the year, cold. And remember when he got off. But we used to almost every camp, you'd have to spot those trains. When you didn't have much of a train, well, 30, 40 cars, it wasn't too bad. When you had more than that, you know, then you had to load their deer. Had to spot it pretty close. Yeah.
What was it like when the potato traffic was at its peak? That must have been a busy time for you.
Yes, We used to work all night at Fort Kent, and then we had Fort Kent and Bradbury done, and then you go down and you started at Robbins, St. Louis, Friendville, and Cleveland, and we'd work all night steady. A lot of times, of course, then there was 16 hours, and then after a while it dropped to 14, and then 12, and now it's 8. But and a lot of times we spent the whole 16 hours switching potatoes. And then when we came back from Friendville, we had to leave all of that stuff, the K4s and your main centrals and the BMs open and make up 212. And so 212 could just, a lot of times we'd put their buggy on if it was late enough, or if the boys were up, we'd put their buggy on so they wouldn't have to do that, see, if we had time to.
In a 24-hour period during the peak of the potato traffic, would you guess how many potatoes would come down the branch?
Oh my God, Jared, I got no idea. A lot of times I know they'd, well, of course your records would have that, but you'd have about all you could do a lot of times to haul a train out of Fort Kent with 2 units. I was on the extra one time, and while we had his pulp and what few potatoes we got out of the branch, and we were doing the work between St. Francis and Eagle Lake, and the local would have to push us out of Fort Kent. That's how much of a train we had, just out of, But that was just, well, mostly pulp and wood products. But your potatoes, I couldn't say really.
Tell me again how you come to work for the railroad.
Well, Bert Mitchell's the one that talked me into it. He stopped by one time. He used to walk home and buy home, coming back from work. And he hollered to my mother one time. He says, he was back from the service, and I was just hanging around. He says, tell Lionel that the B&A is looking for brakemen. So I went down, and I hired on. I worked 1 year. That year I spent in Oakfield Yard. And I thought that, well, I got a job. I was express agent of home, Rail Express, for another year there. And then that was slowing up. And so they were hiring again. So I thought, I'll give that another try. So that's when I come on the second time. And when I went to work, I think it was Bert. He says, when can you come to work? I says, I can come to work anytime. He looked at the board and he says, well, how about plow train out of Fort Kent tomorrow? I said, great. So that's...
Looking back over your life, are you glad you spent it that way?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Why?
It's just as I say, I've always liked any job. I was a brakeman, conductor, fireman, and engineer, and any job that they'd call me for in the morning, I was glad to go. And I was anxious for the next day to go to work, and there was never a day that I didn't like my work. So.
You've worked with train crews all your life, and you're, what, 65?
Right now, 67.
Do you think railroad people are any different than any other kind of worker?
Well...
Is there anything unique about them?
Well, sometimes I think, but I wouldn't know how to say it, Dick. But no, I couldn't then.
Okay. One of the questions I've asked the people I've talked with is if sometimes it seems as though the business that we're in isn't relevant anymore. Do you think railroads are obsolete? Do you think there's any need for them anymore?
I don't think they're obsolete. I think they need them. Of course, you got all these trucks on the road now, and well, I met some on the way down today there. My God, I almost had to. It'll almost blow you right off the road with that slush, If
you're going to use your crystal ball and look into the future, into the next century, What do you see happening in transportation?
I can't see railroads going out of business. What do you think of that? Because there's too much stuff to move. And I don't think that the trucks can handle them all and have safe roads. Right now they're talking about these double trailers. And it's almost a train.
You had kind of a unique career. You were both a rear-end crew person and a conductor, which is really the boss of the train. But yet you were also the engineer, who every kid when I was growing up would have given his life to be, sitting there 10 feet above that track and being a king of all he surveyed. That must have been kind of an interesting transition for you when you went.
It was. When I first started on, of course, I liked the railroad, the riding up in there and waving people on, going by, and well, I wasn't an engineer, and I knew I could never be, because I started as a brakeman. But when they offered me a chance to become an engineer, I didn't have to think twice, because that was something that I always had back in my mind anyway, if I ever could. Hey.
What skills what are the skills that you need to be a good engineer? I know there are good ones and bad ones, and I don't know that, I can tell when I'm riding behind them, but I don't know what makes it.
Well, it's you get your feel of your track, know the condition of your track, and then the weight of your train, and a lot of times where your empties are and so forth, and of course the length, and there's a lot to, and to be able to, well, as you say, to make an application so your rear won't run into you, so they won't get that snap back there. It's all something that you learn. I suppose after you go, and the boys will tell you, well, I got a poke here and stuff like that. And you can, if you know of course you know the layout of your track, so you know when your rear is going to run into you and going to get run-ins and run-outs, and that's when you get your pokes back there, your rough rides.
What's the most memorable experience you had as an engineer? Did you ever put one on the ground?
Yes, that would be, you can break through ice with an engine, because it's quite heavy, and if it's dry ice. But if you have stuff like was coming down there, like today home there, that stuff, and you're riding, you're trying, and you're kind of stuck, and you ride back and forth on that, well, that stuff will build up, and it doesn't break. You seem to just ride under your wheels, and then you go off. But a dry ice, you can break quite a bit of dry ice. It'll bust up in small pieces. And
the other thing I wanted to ask you about, I would think it'd be very tough as a couple to raise a family working the hours that you did. How did you manage that? How did Martha manage that?
Well, she just, except me when I'd come in. There was no more than that. Or else, when I was on the local at Fort Kent, well, that was nice. Home every night. Of course, you didn't have much time to see anybody, because you weren't home very long. You said you had to sleep and wash up and clean up and then get ready and go to work, but you were home anyway. But she never complained about that, and I never did either.
What have I not asked you that I should have asked you?
The railroad, as far as you take everything in stride. So there's some things that you'll remember more than others, but it's always something that you accept today, and maybe it'll show up tomorrow, or maybe it won't. But there's nothing really that shows up or you remember. One thing well, of course, it has nothing to do with the railroad, I suppose, but we hit a deer one time. It was on a plow train just north of Nixon. And the brakeman says he pulled the air. All we had was a plow and the engine. He pulled the air and he says, I says, now what, Ron? He says, we hit a deer. He says, well, we'll back up and see if, you know. We backed up and, you know, we picked up that deer and threw him. We were doing 45 miles an hour. We threw him, he went up in that apron, and we seen where he landed, and then we see where he jumped. Was gone. Not a bit of blood. There was so much snow, I suppose, we just picked him up. We didn't hurt his legs, or just, that's one thing that I remember, stuff like that.
I'll bet he was the most surprised deer in Buffalo Plantation.
Yeah.
That's an excellent interview, and I thank you. I think it was real nice of you to come down.
Well, I didn't mind coming down at all. I like to leave town once in a while, take a little ride.